Hi, I am Dr. Rasheem. I am an independent scholar, social science researcher. Most of my scholarship encourages critical examination of culture through the lens of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, basically things that have a connection with identity. As an instructor, I'm very much committed to helping students gain a deeper insight into interdisciplinary, cross-cultural, intersectional approaches to the academic study of marginalized populations. Today, I would like to have a conversation with you about structural racism, and even more specifically, understanding structural racism. What is meant by that term when we actually say the word structural racism? What does that mean? One might ask why it's important. I doubt in this day and age anyone would really ask why it's important to really understand that, but just in case they did, one of the reasons is just despite the decades of legal and social reform that's aimed at reducing inequity, reducing inequality, structural racism still continues to be a significant problem in society and in most organizations. Subsequently, we have conversations around structural racism or around institutional racism. However, we don't really have a mutual understanding of exactly what it is we're talking about when we say the term structural racism. I believe it's because of that lack of understanding that we end up perpetuating harm around the very thing that we're seeking to actually reduce. So that's the reason why I really want to have this conversation today. So, in order to get into a really good understanding of structural racism, we really have to engage some other terms. One of those terms being institutional power, right? So, what is institutional power? Institutional power is very basically the ability or official authority to decide what is best for others. The ability to decide who will have access to resources and the capacity to exercise control over others. If you have that, you have institutional power, particularly when you're able to exercise that control or decide what is best for others without their input or say. Then you have institutional power. And depending upon the types of institution, there's different people who have certain types of power in different institutions. Hierarchically, it's usually those that are at the top of that particular institution or those institutions who have power. So just getting on terms with some of the language there. Another commonly used term is oppression. So oppression is the combination of prejudice and institutional power, right? So that creates a system that discriminates against some groups. So sometimes they're called targeted groups, and it benefits other groups. Sometimes those are called dominant groups, right? So you have these two groups. There's the target group and the dominant group. And oppression is the combination of prejudice and institutional power to enact some of those prejudice on the targeted group. Now, examples of these systems exist in racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, classism, ageism, anti-Semitism. All of these isms are examples of oppressions. So you have the dominant group, so let's say in sexism, right? The dominant group would be identified as male, and they have the ability, the power, the access, and the structures to support the establishing of rules and regulations that impact women, and they're able to do it large times without the input of those women and exercise that. And then when you have racism, it's the same thing, just with race. So you have, in that particular scenario, the target group, let's say, for the sake of this conversation, we're going to say Black folks are the target group, and then the dominant group would be white people. And they have the power, the institution to enact oppression over the other group. Now, the thing is when those connect, that's where there's action, right? So you can actually have institutional power doesn't necessarily mean that you're oppressive, but the fact that you have institutional power over another can in and of itself be an issue, particularly if they don't have access to be able to participate in the structures and determining the rules of that power, and if that access is limited. So if you have the combination of both prejudice and institutional power to then enact on that particular group. So in the context of women and men, it's sexism. In the context of race, it is racism. There's also heterosexism, right? So you have a set of people who then can set up rules that give or deny access to people. And then you, of course, you have the same thing, the target group, and you also have the dominant group. So the dominant group in that particular scenario would be the group of folks who are heterosexual, and then you have the umbrella. I'm going to just use the umbrella queer or LGBTQIA plus to identify that group. That group gets to determine whether or not you get married. Something as simple as that. Can you have health care? Can you not have health care? Who can be a beneficiary on your benefits and that sort of thing, right? So you still have this institutional power determining rules, regulations, and policies that affect this target group, and that enacts oppression. It's very, very important to understand those two things when we are talking about structural racism, because if you don't understand institutional power, if you don't understand oppression and how that works, then you won't be able to really grasp the full concept of structural racism. So these systems enable dominant groups to exert control over the target groups by limiting their rights, their freedoms, their access to basic resources, healthcare, education, employment, housing, a gambit of just basic rights. That is the inaction of institutional power, and that is how oppression works. So earlier we discussed a bit about institutional power and how that enacts with oppression, and then we identified these two different groups, right? So we have the dominant group, and then we have the target group. Target groups largely referred to as minority. So another way of putting that with minority, or a better way to explain the actual meaning of minority, is basically any group of people who, because of their physical, cultural characteristic, beliefs sometimes, are basically singled out, set apart, and they are also a large number of the times are smaller in number. Not always, but a large number of times they're smaller in number. If they aren't smaller in number, they are smaller in their access to power and information and resources. So that, in that particular context, is what helps to identify when we use terms like minority. So all of this is really good for setting the stage for talking about institutional racism, right? So we need to understand what is institutional power, what is oppression, and of course, what is a minority. Another thing that's very helpful to understand is concepts of racism. So racism in and of itself, it's a system of advantages based on race. And it's also supported by institutions, policies, practices that benefit dominant groups and disadvantage minority groups. I believe the most common ways in which we interact with racism are how people feel about other people, right? So there's actually 5 levels of racism, or isms really, and then there's like a way in which we most commonly refer to it and use it, and then there's ways in which it enacts it on other levels. So one of the first of those 5 levels is the personal level, the individual level, that is connected to values, beliefs, things like prejudice or bias are sometimes used interchangeably when we're talking about that type of racism. It's like, I don't like this particular set of people, or I have a belief about these people that they are inferior or less than, and I'm biased and I'm prejudging them without knowing, right? So that's more of like the personal level of how racism operates. Just one separate from that is interpersonal. Sounds like it's the same thing. The difference between the personal and the interpersonal is the personal is very interior. It's very, what are my values? What are my beliefs? What are my thoughts? What are my prejudgments? What are my biases? It's in here. The interpersonal is interaction, right? So what are your actions that you then carry out as a result of those beliefs? What are the behaviors that you have in interaction with or in reference to that particular group? What type of language you use when you're describing them? And just generally how they're referenced in your interactions and in your language. The next level, or another level, I would say, is institutional. That's the one that we're going to spend most of our time on in this conversation. And institutional are basically rules, policies, procedures, practices that work better for one set of people than they do for another set of people. And in this instance, we're just going to say they work better for white people than, let's say, Black, Indigenous, or people of color, inadvertently sometimes. So how this shows up a lot of times is these practices are embedded. And they're embedded in an organizational structure. One of the things that makes that so important to identify and understand is see how that is separate, but not less harmful than the personal, individual, or interpersonal racism, is because it does not require malintent. And because it is baked in or embedded into the rules, the policies, the procedures, the institutions, the practices, it does not require a level of intent, and it can be carried out by any body of person. So if I have a structure or a system, or if I have set up a game, and in the rules of the game, I have already set up that this person is going to start 3 steps ahead, this person is going to start here. Because they have on a blue shirt, every time they pass this point, they're going to get $500. It doesn't matter who else I put in that game. It doesn't matter what set or how we then relocate another person. It could be another person that is that same color, that same gender, with that same background. If they are placed within a game that I have already set the rules and the policies and procedures, then they are just system maintainers. They are maintaining a system that is already set. So this is a way in which you can get institutional racism that are carried out by Black and brown people, because it does not require personal, individual bias. It does not require malintent. That's one of the most challenging things to understand, because I think one of the first things that comes up if we describe an institution or an action as racist, I think what it does is it attacks a person's innocence. It attacks their belief about themselves, about them being a good-natured person, or they're being kind, or they're very neutral. And so it's very important to make those distinctions, to say, no, that this, because of the definition of institutional racism, which are rules, policies, procedures, practices that work better for white people than they do for people of color. If that is the case, then that particular practice or rule or structure is racist, for lack of a better term. So another aspect of a level of isms or oppression sometimes is connected to culture, right? So there's beauty and ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism is just a way in which we evaluate other people and cultures according to standards of our own culture. So not saying just that you prefer your own culture to other people's culture. There's nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, I encourage people to prefer and celebrate their culture. It is when you use measurements of standards of your own culture and you apply that to another culture and you measure their values, you measure their goodness as people based on your own cultural values. Let's just take something that's really easy to jump on. Let's say beauty, right? And so if in this particular culture, it is something significant in that culture, a symbol of beauty is to weigh 250 pounds plus. Let's say it's a sign of fertility and men are attracted to it. So women in that culture tend to adopt that beauty standard. An ethnocentric approach would be to then see that and then say something like this person is ugly or obese or they're wrong or they're bad or they're just something negative by which your standards, if your ethnocentric view is that this is what beauty looks like, it is supposed to be slender, it is supposed to be like this, their nose should be like this, their hair should be this, their skin and eyes. That's one of the, I would say, more lighter levels of isms. Now, the biggest one, and I would say like the bigger circular overview, if I could paint in your mind another ecological system, is structural. Structural is basically includes history, it includes political context, and it includes social context when we're talking about structural racism. So laws that have said that this person can vote and cannot vote, laws that say this person can get married, or this person is 3/5 human being, or this in this scenario we're given access to opportunity, and this other access in this other setup we're denied that. So let's take a step back. Let's rewind back just a little bit to go through those 5 levels. So if we're picturing circles, I love circles. In that center circle, we're talking about the personal, the individual, my feelings, my beliefs, my values. Let's say the person is prejudiced, they're biased. Their feelings at that level only impact them. Unimpactful, unimportant. That's your problem, not anyone else's, right? Interpersonals are your actions, your behaviors, language. So now I'm coming into contact. This is one circle outside of myself. I'm coming into contact with other people, and I might say racial slurs. I might skip them on the freeway, little things like that. So now this level of racism has not just been internal to me and my internal mind of bias. Now I'm acting upon it when I'm interacting with other people. Then the next level up from that is institutions. So in my workplace, there are certain policies and rules, for example, that advantage white people and disadvantage black people. Now, this is not just personal. Now, this is just not me and Bob. Now, this is a whole structure that then supports a particular set of beliefs, even if those beliefs are not then even currently active, right? The end result of institutional racism is what is most important in that particular dynamic. And then if you go even further out from that, you have this structural racism, and that structural racism again is the historical political context that is at this outside larger level. So it's very important to be able to identify and understand those very different levels and very different spaces when we're engaging and talking about racism. It frequently comes up that people rarely separate institutional and structural racism. I think largely because you have this microsystem, right, which is structural racism. That is the history, the general rule. Supreme Court judges are a part of the structure, right? The Justice Department would be also something that's somewhat part of the historical structure. But then within that, you have institution. So institution is, where do you work? Where do your kids go to school? Where do you shop? All of that is within that greater structure. All of that is impacted by, all of those institutions are impacted by that greater structure. So it's very important to be able to just identify those particular layers. Another challenging thing about institutional racism that makes it a lot less obvious, one, again, because you can have, as I said before, black and brown bodies in place that still carry out policies and procedures and practices that put a set of people at an advantage and another set of people at a disadvantage, right? That can still take place. Sometimes that shows up very directly and very obviously in tokenization. So tokenization is just basically the appointing of people of color in leadership positions, but in limiting their power, limiting their voice, limiting their access, limiting their influence over any meaningful decision. Other aspects of tokenization is using a person of color as a proverbial get out of racism free card, right? So I have a person on my board who is African American, ergo, there's no way that my organization could be racist. Could not possibly happen. Another way in which tokenization is enacted, if a person is put on the board, but they're put on, I don't know, let's say the planning committee for a big event, they're put on the fashion show, or just the diversity and inclusion committee, right? So they're on the board, and there's something that's very visible about their identity as it connects to their value on that board. When it comes to something like, we need to appoint a black person, we only have a few black people, we're going to put them all on the diversity and inclusion committee. They're going to make sure that we're not racist, and we will get our get out of racism free card. We're great. Sometimes it is knowing. There is a level of understanding how things are perceived, and also there are ways in which there is performative allyship that takes place. Let's take, for example, Black Lives Matter movement, and even more in recent months, the spike in interest in the Black Lives movement, and not just the spike in interest, but a spike in support by white-led organizations that was not really there before. So what happens is it is not okay to not support at this point where there's like a spike in interest or a spike in support around Black Lives Matter movement. It's not okay to not do that. It's seen as largely in a lot of cases, there's a lot of organizations that have released statements, and they've done other forms of performative allyship that is symbolic or tokenization. I like symbols. I even like tokens, honestly. I think when it stops there, that becomes the challenge. When the solution to fixing institutional or structural racism are things like, I will paint this street and it will say Black Lives Matter, but I will not do any sort of policy or structural change. Or I make syrup and I will change the name of this syrup that has had a racist connection to slavery for years, but I won't do anything to increase the salaries of underpaid people of color on my staff. Or I will wear this garb and I will take a knee in this very performative allyship way and do these things that I had never thought of before, and that will stop there. Those are another way in which institutional racism, as any other system, tries to protect itself. That's one of the tricky things about system. They act in ways where they try to protect themselves, and that's one of the ways in which they do that. That comes up a lot of times when it's connected with something called solutions privilege. So solutions privilege is basically just the privilege of expecting an easy, instant solution that will align with your own worldview and not challenge your own privilege, right? So naming a football team, changing the name of a football team from Redskins to, let's say, the Washington football team, is a way of solutions privilege. That's a way of expecting an easy, instant solution. Boom, I've done this. It doesn't challenge my worldview. And it tends to manifest in a few different ways. I'll try to outline at least about 4 or 5 of those different ways, right? So one, there's the expectation that others will provide the solution, even to problems that that the organization or institution themselves are perpetuating. So that's one way that it comes up. Other people have to provide the solution. If you say something wrong, then what am I supposed to do? Give me the rule book on what I need to do to fix it, right? Another one is just an inability to render solutions that we don't agree with. If a person, for example, decided that their act of providing a solution was to say, hey, we really need to increase the salaries of all of our folks who work here because it's inequitable. And if you just don't agree with that, or sometimes if it's too costly, then there's resistance around that. Another method of solutions privilege in a way in which systems work to protect itself is selective logic that only allows for reasoning that is aligned with our existing viewpoints or values. So it's kind of connected to the other one. So resistance of solutions that just doesn't resonate, or it doesn't resonate sometimes because it's too costly. It costs too much to do this. Let's say, for example, let's say if it's reparations. Yes, we know that this is right. It costs too much. Or it'll also go back to that first one that I mentioned. How are we going to do that? If I'm saying that this is the right thing to do, I'm saying that this is right, I'm saying that a set of people have been wrong, I don't know how to do it, and unless you can show me how to do it, then we're not going to do it. Another way in which this solution privilege shows up in institutional racism is a sense of superiority combined with infantilizing people of marginalized identities. So it's also very kind of sometimes paternalistic. Like, in order to provide access or give opportunity to a set of people of color, instead of acknowledging their value, then the way of promoting them or giving them a raise, you are doing them a favor, right? You are taking care of them in that, and it's a way of doing some of the work, but without acknowledging any form of guilt. Another aspect is the inability to see the irony in complaining about people complaining without offering solutions, with not offering any solutions. All of those are ways in which D'Angelo Robin talks a bit about white fragility. So all of those are some ways in which the solutions privilege operates, and it operates in a way of protecting white fragility. She identifies white fragility as a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable. It is triggering, it is offensive, you are being divisive. The structural system in and of itself isn't bad, but you pointing it out, you bring it to my attention, you making me have to look at it, it makes me feel uncomfortable. It is stress inducing, and it often ends up in a state or in a situation, because if that person does not have an institution that then protects them for speaking up, those people can then be let go for any assault on or any attack on white fragility. That's another one of the ways in which how institutional racism operates, and another way that we can do better to work about understanding it. Racism, again, in institution, it's not overt. Everyone has, to some degree, realized that regardless of that first level of the ism that we talked about or mentioned earlier, about my own bias, my own personal belief, they realize at the end of the day, even if they feel that internally, it's just not cool to say. You know, people will look at you in a very awkward side-eye sort of way if it's said. There's also, it happens that sometimes people aren't aware of their own bias, of their own implicit bias. So how that shows up in interacting with people are microaggressions. So Pierce Chester in 1970 coined the term microaggressions, and he sets it up and says that it is defined as a brief, commonplace, daily, verbal, sometimes nonverbal, behavioral and environmental communications, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target a person because they belong to a stigmatized group. So there are several examples of microaggression, but I think the thing that is so important in having a conversation around understanding institutional racism, and I feel like microaggressions points out, it could be a daily commonplace thing. It is extremely normalized, extremely just a part of our everyday jargon. And microaggressions aren't just racial. They're baked into all of the isms. They're baked into sexism. For example, if a woman goes into work and her boss comments on something about, why don't you wear makeup? more? Why don't you smile more? That could be seen as very light, very small, but it communicates hostility. It's derogatory, and it sends a negative message to the person that is being targeted in that instance. So that's one aspect that'll help us also understand institutional racism. And one of the things that I want to do outside of all of these terms is I want to provide you with a few more examples of how you may be able to see this show up in your own institutions, and also just being aware of it in your everyday life or in other institutions that you might come in contact with. So one aspect of institutional racism, that's probably one of the more obvious ones, all the decision makers are white. And if you have the combination of all the decision makers are white and all the frontline staff or storytellers are people of color, that usually takes place in nonprofit environments. But that's definitely a demonstration of institutional racism. An organization that only hire people of color to do people of color stuff. So I'll hire you to head up Kwanzaa, or I'll hire you during Black History Month, or I'll hire you or put you on the board so that you could be on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. I won't hire you as an accountant. You can't be on the governance board, that sort of thing. Also, something that I'm seeing a lot more now is just making people of color responsible for dismantling and maintaining the organization's diversity, equity, and inclusion training. That should not be that person's role or job. That goes back up to what we mentioned earlier around the solutions privilege, asking people of color to solve problems that they did not create. Another way that you can see, or another way to understand institutional racism, is using people of color as your mouthpiece or your shield against other people of color, right? So if you're called out for racist behavior or discriminatory behavior or being inequitable, you call on your other person of color friend to then jump in and go ahead and tell them that I'm not racist. Like, explain to them. And I will say one of the last ones that I'll share, and I feel like I've shared it earlier, but I think it comes up a lot more commonplace, and that is putting people of color in symbolic power, right? And what that does is it encourages them to do the work of performing and encourages them to do the work of performing while the organization accepts the intellectual property of their ideas, but not allow them to make budgets and decisions. I'll say that again. Putting people of color in symbolic power that encourages them to do the work of programming and accepting their intellectual property of ideas, but not allowing them to make actual budget decisions. All of these examples are simply just examples of some of the ways in which structural racism shows up. And I hope that this has provided for you a better understanding of a better way of how to understand structural racism, how to understand institutional power and oppression. I believe that racism is a powerful force that inhibits our progress towards justice, peace, and prosperity. So if we can use these tools, use some of this information to provide a deeper understanding for exactly what is institutional racism, how have I been complicit or colluded or supported these systems, and how can I seek and operate to no longer cause, produce, or perpetuate harm? Then if you get that, then I've done my job.